A morning in the wet season somewhere along the middle reaches of the Paraná River in the border region between northeastern Argentina and Paraguay. Water in the flooded marshes has risen sufficiently to submerge most of the standing vegetation. What appears above the surface, moving in a long, deliberate line across an open stretch of water that would take a small boat several minutes to cross, is a set of paired antlers that at first glance could be mistaken for a floating tree branch. Below the antlers, the head of a large mammal. Below the head, the powerful shoulders of an animal that most people who have never seen one alive do not, on first observation, immediately identify as a deer. He is swimming, slowly, deliberately, without any apparent difficulty. His antlers, which in a mature male can span nearly a full metre and carry as many as 16 sharp branching points, remain above the water at a specific angle that keeps them dry. His large white-fringed ears turn independently, tracking sound. His long, dark legs, which have been described by South American wildlife biologists as the most elongated leg proportions of any deer species living on Earth, are folded up beneath him. He is crossing to a specific point on the opposite bank, roughly 400 meters distant, where a small patch of aquatic grass has emerged into the new water level and where he will resume feeding. He is one of a species called Blastocerus dichotomus. In English, the marsh deer. In Portuguese, the cervo do pantanal, meaning the deer of the marshland. In Spanish, ciervo de los pantanos, carrying the same meaning. He is the largest living deer species native to the entire South American continent. His head to body length reaches approximately 2 meters. His shoulder height reaches approximately 1 2/10 meters. His weight, when he is in good condition and the wet season has been generous, can approach 110 kilograms. He is also, on the specific morning I am describing, one of a species that has lost approximately 65% of its historical geographic range within the past century, and that continues to lose additional habitat, additional individuals, and additional genetic diversity, essentially every year. I want to tell you about him today because his species is one of the largest, most cinematically remarkable, and most systematically overlooked mammals of the modern South American continent. And the specific reasons his species has been vanishing across country after country of its former range, along with the specific efforts a small number of committed researchers have been making to hold what remains against ongoing loss, is a story that virtually no one outside the specific circle of neotropical mammal biologists has heard. Let me start with what he actually is, because to understand the loss and the ongoing effort to prevent it, you have to understand the animal. The marsh deer is what wildlife biologists call an obligate wetland specialist. His entire evolutionary history, according to the peer-reviewed paleontological reconstruction, has been spent in the specific wetland habitats of tropical and subtropical South America. His anatomy reflects that history in specific ways that distinguish him from every other deer species on the continent. His hooves are exceptionally long and widely splayed, providing the equivalent of natural snowshoes across the specific mud and floating vegetation that he traverses. His legs, which can appear disproportionately long, are adapted to allow him to wade through water that would submerge shorter-legged deer species. His body proportions are optimized for swimming, which he does regularly and with genuine ease, sometimes crossing rivers approaching 2 kilometers wide during the specific seasonal migrations that follow the rising and falling water levels of the wetlands he inhabits. His preferred water depth is under 70 centimeters. He does not, according to the field observations compiled by South American mammal researchers, seek out deep water. He seeks out the specific transitional zone at the edge of the flood, where dense aquatic vegetation provides both food and cover, and where the specific water depth is shallow enough that he can wade rather than swim. When water levels rise beyond his preferred depth, he moves. When they fall, he moves back. His entire annual cycle is structured around this specific seasonal migration through the flooding pulse of the wetland systems he depends on. His diet, according to the peer-reviewed dietary studies, is almost entirely herbivorous. Aquatic grasses, emergent vegetation, the soft green leaves and stems of the specific marshland plants that emerge into the shallow water zone he inhabits. He consumes an estimated 8 to 12 kilograms of vegetation per day, depending on his body condition and the season. He is a rumen digester, like all deer, but his rumen has been adapted for the specific high water content vegetation of his wetland habitat. His social structure is loose. Unlike some deer species that form large defensive herds, the marsh deer typically moves alone or in small family groups consisting of a female and her most recent offspring. Males are largely solitary outside of the specific breeding season. Territory is not, according to the behavioral studies conducted across the species range, defended in the way that some deer species defend territory. What the marsh deer defends, functionally, is his access to the specific patches of high-quality wetland habitat that his survival requires. He is one of only 2 deer species in the genus of which he was, historically, the only member. He is, in the technical language of mammalian taxonomy, the single living species of the genus Blastocerus. He has no close living relatives on the continent that share his specific wetland-obligate adaptations. His historical geographic range, according to the reconstruction compiled by the researchers Pinder and Gross in their 1991 assessment, covered essentially every major wetland system in tropical and subtropical South America. From southern Peru and southern Colombia in the northwest, east across the Amazon basin, south through the pantanal wetlands of central Brazil and eastern Bolivia, into the Paraná and Paraguay river systems of Paraguay and northern Argentina, and reaching as far south as the wetlands of northern Uruguay and the northern edges of the Argentine pampas. He was, in the pre-industrial South America, one of the characteristic large mammals of the continental wetland systems. Today, his range has been reduced to a specific set of isolated remnant populations, distributed across geographies that no longer connect to one another. The largest surviving population, and the one that gives the species its best long-term prospects for continued existence, remains in the pantanal wetlands of central Brazil, eastern Bolivia, and northeastern Paraguay. Estimates of the pantanal population vary substantially depending on methodology and specific survey year, but the peer-reviewed consensus places the current pantanal population somewhere between 20 and 35,000 individuals, distributed across an area of approximately 150,000 square kilometers. Outside the pantanal, the population picture becomes substantially more concerning. The Amazon basin populations in the specific alluvial floodplains of southeastern Peru, northeastern Bolivia, and eastern Brazil survive in small, fragmented groups. Population estimates for these populations are difficult, partly because of the specific inaccessibility of the habitat, and partly because comprehensive surveys have not been conducted at continental scale. The best available estimates, according to the recent peer-reviewed literature, suggest that the Amazon basin populations collectively number in the low thousands, distributed across several disconnected watershed systems. The Argentine populations, according to the 2024 microsatellite genetic study by Argentine researchers using amplicon sequencing on fecal DNA samples, are distributed across 4 specific isolated fragments. The Iberá Wetland population in Corrientes province is classified as nationally vulnerable and represents the largest remaining Argentine population, with estimates ranging from several hundred to over 1,000 individuals, depending on the specific survey year and methodology. The Paraná River Delta population, the southernmost surviving population of the species on Earth, is classified as nationally endangered, with estimates suggesting fewer than 500 individuals distributed across the specific islands and marshes of the lower Paraná system. The Formosa province population is classified as endangered. The Middle Paraná River population is classified as critically endangered. Each of these Argentine populations, according to the 2024 genetic study, has now diverged genetically from the others to a sufficient degree that the researchers were able to identify 3 distinct genetic clusters compatible with the geographic locations of the sampled populations. The genetic diversity within each population, measured as expected heterozygosity, was low across the board, with all 3 sampled populations scoring below the specific threshold at which conservation geneticists begin to raise concerns about inbreeding depression and reduced adaptive capacity. The specific pattern the Argentine data reveals is the pattern that conservation biologists across South America have been documenting for the marsh deer across essentially every remaining part of its range. Populations are becoming smaller. They are becoming more isolated from one another. They are losing genetic diversity. They are, in the specific technical framework of small population ecology, approaching the demographic thresholds at which local extinction becomes essentially inevitable. The species has already crossed one of those thresholds. In Uruguay, where the marsh deer once inhabited the specific wetland systems of the north and northeast of the country, the species is now considered nationally extinct. The last confirmed breeding population, according to the reconstruction compiled by Uruguayan wildlife biologists, disappeared during the mid-20th century, driven primarily by conversion of the specific marsh habitats the species depended on into pasture land for cattle, and in some regions into rice paddy agriculture. A 2024 paper published in the journal Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution documented a new confirmed sighting of a solitary individual in northern Uruguay, likely a disperser from adjacent Brazilian or Argentine populations, which the authors used to formally redefine the species' current southern geographic limit. But that single individual did not represent the return of a breeding population. It represented, if anything, the confirmation that the species can still, on rare occasions, cross national borders even after local extinction, without the specific demographic base necessary to actually re-establish. Let me be direct about the specific pressures that have produced this pattern, because the honest picture is genuinely complicated. The primary driver of the marsh deer's decline, according to essentially every peer-reviewed assessment conducted over the past 3 decades, has been habitat loss. The specific wetland systems the species depends on have been drained, dammed, converted to agricultural production, and altered by upstream water management projects that have modified the natural flood cycles the species requires. The Paraná Delta, in the Argentine case, has been progressively converted from natural marshland to commercial forestry plantations, particularly exotic willow and poplar species grown for the specific pulp and lumber markets. The specific 2018 Pantano project publication, an initiative launched in 2015 to conserve the southernmost surviving population of the species, explicitly documented the specific tension between marsh deer conservation and the regional forestry management practices that have progressively eliminated the habitat. In the pantanal, the specific pressures have been different. The pantanal remains, by continental standards, one of the least converted wetland systems in South America, with substantially less agricultural conversion than the Paraná Basin has experienced. But the pantanal has been affected by the specific expansion of extensive cattle ranching operations, by the construction of hydroelectric dams on the specific rivers that feed the pantanal system, and by illegal mining operations that have contaminated specific waterways with mercury and other pollutants. The 2016 IUCN Red List assessment for the species specifically identified mining as a serious threat to the pantanal population. Hunting has been a secondary but persistent pressure across essentially the entire range. Marsh deer are, in specific technical terms, easy to hunt. Their large body size, their dependency on predictable wetland habitats, their tendency to stand still and observe rather than immediately fleeing from unfamiliar sounds, and their preference for shallow water where they can be approached by boat, all combine to make them a specifically vulnerable target for both subsistence hunters and commercial poachers. Enforcement of the specific hunting protections that exist on paper across the species range has been, according to the peer-reviewed assessments, uneven at best. Disease represents another specific pressure that has become increasingly important as marsh deer populations have come into closer contact with domestic cattle across the range. During the 1970s, according to the IUCN Red List documentation, extensive marsh deer mortality was reported in Bolivia, with reproductive failure becoming reportedly common across the specific populations that had come into contact with newly introduced cattle diseases. The specific pathogens implicated included several tick-borne diseases, several viral cattle diseases that had not previously affected wild deer populations, and the specific combination of parasites and pathogens that had accumulated within the intensive cattle systems of the region. In Brazil, according to the recent peer-reviewed veterinary literature, tick infestation has been documented as one of the leading causes of marsh deer mortality after habitat loss. Predation by domestic dogs has emerged as a specific concern in the southernmost populations. The 2018 Pantano Project paper documented dog predation as one of the 3 specific threats facing the Paraná Delta population, alongside poaching and habitat conversion. The specific mechanism, according to the field observations, involves free-ranging dogs from adjacent rural human settlements that enter the marshland and hunt marsh deer, particularly fawns and adult females. The specific vulnerability of the species to dog predation is one of the factors that has contributed to the Argentine researchers' proposal to upgrade the national conservation status of the Paraná Delta population from vulnerable to endangered. Let me tell you about the specific research effort that has been quietly holding the line across the remaining marsh deer range, because it deserves to be recognized. The Pantano Project, launched in 2015 and formally described in the 2018 peer-reviewed publication, brought together Argentine researchers, veterinarians, park rangers, and local community members from the specific rural communities adjacent to the Paraná Delta wetlands. Their approach was multi-component. Systematic population monitoring using a combination of unmanned aerial vehicle surveys, camera trap networks, and traditional field observation. Environmental education programs focused on the specific rural communities whose land management decisions affect the marsh deer habitat. Public awareness campaigns designed to reduce the specific hunting pressure and dog predation that have been documented as leading threats. Coordinated research on the specific genetic, ecological, and disease-related pressures that the population was facing. The specific participatory surveillance system for marsh deer morbidity and mortality, described in the 2020 peer-reviewed publication that documented 3 years of data collection from 2014 through 2017, engaged a broader network of researchers, field partners, and decision-makers across the 2 largest surviving Argentine populations. 44 marsh deer in various stages of health decline or post-mortem were evaluated during the study period, providing the first systematic data set on marsh deer health conditions across an Argentine population. The specific study, published in the journal BMC Veterinary Research, provided the empirical foundation for the subsequent health management decisions being made across the Argentine populations. The 2024 fecal microsatellite study, published in the journal Scientific Reports by an Argentine research team using amplicon sequencing on non-invasively collected fecal DNA samples, provided the first comprehensive assessment of the genetic status of the surviving Argentine marsh deer populations. The specific finding that all three sample populations showed low genetic diversity with expected heterozygosity values below the threshold at which conservation geneticists become concerned about inbreeding depression, established the specific genetic baseline against which future management decisions will need to be made. None of these efforts individually will save the species. What they collectively demonstrate is that the specific technical, ecological, and social conditions necessary for marsh deer recovery are being systematically documented across the species range. The knowledge base is being built. The specific interventions that will be required to prevent additional local extinctions are being identified. The specific communities whose cooperation will be required to implement those interventions are being engaged. Whether that knowledge and engagement will translate into actual population recovery at the specific timescales that the ongoing declines require remains an open question. I want to be direct about the honest complications because they matter. The marsh deer is not, at the current time, being actively reintroduced to any part of its former range from which it has been eliminated. Unlike the giant otter, which returned to Argentina through a specific coordinated captive breeding and release program conducted by Rewilding Argentina in cooperation with European zoos, the marsh deer has not been the subject of a comparable reintroduction effort. Recovery of the species, if it happens, will depend on the specific persistence and expansion of the remaining fragmented populations, rather than on the specific reintroduction of captive-bred stock. The specific captive population that would be required to support a large-scale reintroduction effort does not currently exist. Marsh deer are, in real practical terms, exceptionally difficult to maintain in captivity. Their specific wetland habitat requirements, their large body size, their sensitivity to stress, and their vulnerability to captive transmitted diseases have all combined to make sustained captive breeding programs substantially more challenging than for many other South American ungulate species. A small number of zoos and specialized wildlife facilities maintain individual animals or small groups, but no coordinated, multi-facility captive breeding network of the specific scale that would be required for reintroduction currently operates for the species. The specific genetic diversity issues documented in the 2024 microsatellite study raise concerns about the long-term adaptive capacity of the surviving populations. Populations that have lost substantial genetic diversity are, according to the peer-reviewed conservation genetics literature, more vulnerable to novel diseases, more vulnerable to climate change, and more vulnerable to the specific stochastic events that can drive small populations to local extinction. Reversing the loss of genetic diversity once it has occurred requires either the introduction of individuals from other populations or the specific management of natural gene flow across the range. Neither approach is currently being implemented at the scale that the genetic data suggest would be necessary. Climate change introduces additional uncertainty. The specific hydrological patterns that the marsh deer depends on, including the annual flooding cycles that structure his seasonal movements, and the specific water level ranges that determine his habitat quality, are shifting across essentially every part of the species range. Whether the current populations will remain compatible with the future hydrological conditions of their specific habitats depends on how much and how rapidly the regional climates change over the coming decades, which lies substantially outside the direct management authority of the wildlife conservation agencies working on the species. But he is still there. On the day I am writing this, somewhere in the Pantanal or the Iberá Wetlands or the Paraná Delta or the alluvial floodplains of southeastern Peru, individual marsh deer are moving through their specific patches of remaining habitat, swimming across rivers that connect one patch of wetland to the next, foraging on aquatic grasses that grow in the shallow water where they have foraged for the specific evolutionary time that produced them. Individual females are raising fawns. Individual males are, during the specific breeding season each year, competing for access to those females. The specific ecological role they play in the aquatic and semi-aquatic food webs of the continental wetlands continues to be played out in the specific fragmented patches of habitat that remain to them. The specific work being done to hold what remains by the Argentine researchers of the Pantano project, by the Brazilian wildlife biologists working across the Pantanal, by the small teams of Peruvian and Bolivian conservationists monitoring the specific Amazon basin populations, by the network of veterinarians and local community members participating in the participatory surveillance systems that have been established across the range, represents the specific, patient, decades-long effort that species conservation actually requires. It does not produce dramatic reintroduction moments. It does not generate viral news coverage. It does not, in most cases, receive the specific philanthropic attention that has flowed to more charismatic species. What it does produce, according to the specific data emerging from the peer-reviewed monitoring across the range, is a species that has not yet gone extinct. The populations are smaller than they were 50 years ago. They are more genetically isolated. They face pressures that were not previously understood. But they are, on the day I am writing this, still present in the specific wetlands that produced them. Whether they will remain present at the demographic thresholds necessary for long-term persistence depends on the specific decisions being made right now across the 6 countries where remaining populations survive. It depends on the specific enforcement of existing hunting protections. It depends on the specific management of the wetland habitats the species requires. It depends on the specific willingness of the international conservation community to sustain the specific unglamorous, decades-long research and monitoring work that maintaining a species like the marsh deer actually requires. He is swimming across the river as I am writing this. His antlers are above the water. His long, dark legs are folded beneath him. He is heading for a specific patch of aquatic grass on the opposite bank that has emerged into the new water level and where he will resume feeding. If the wetland he is crossing continues to receive its annual flood pulse, if the forestry plantations that have replaced portions of his historical habitat do not continue to expand into the specific reaches he still uses, if the domestic dogs that have followed rural human settlement into his range do not reach the specific corner of the marsh where his family currently forages, and if the specific genetic diversity that his population still carries proves sufficient to sustain the reproductive success necessary for population maintenance, he will reach the opposite bank. He will find the grass. He will feed. That is, on the day I am writing this, what the ongoing survival of the largest living deer species of the entire South American continent actually looks like. If you found this story surprising, or if you found yourself thinking about the specific species declared nationally extinct across other parts of the world that have not yet received the specific coordinated recovery attention that a marsh deer situation ultimately requires, drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you would like to see more coverage of the quiet, unheralded conservation efforts that are keeping species alive in places where the specific pressures that could eliminate them continue to operate, working at the specific decade and longer timescales that species survival actually requires, consider subscribing. Some of the most consequential conservation work being done anywhere on Earth right now is being done in exactly this kind of place, by people whose names most viewers will never encounter, for species that most viewers have never heard of. I'm Edmund Hale. Thanks for watching.